obviously. But Stacy's already told you about me a little bit, so I won't go through all of that other than to say that I am an absolute ADA geek. And this is what I looked like before I started doing ADA. This is a little bit more what I look like now. But this is kind of what I looked like back in 2011. And the reason I show you this is that I had a bicycle accident and broke my neck. I was very fortunate that I'm doing really well. No repercussions from it. But what I want to share with you is that being a person with a disability is the only minority that you can join. Every other minority you're born into. So tomorrow you could be a person with a disability. So this could impact you, your family. So it's not just them out there. It could be all of us tomorrow at the snap of a finger. So you have to keep that in mind. It's a paradigm shift. Think about it. It's the right thing to do for quote them unquote, but it could be us. So keep that in mind, please. That's where I landed. That's how I landed. Again, I'm good now, but back then it was a little scary. So what the lawyers make us say. I am not an attorney. I did not play one on TV. I did not sleep in a Holiday Inn Express last night. So what I am giving today is only my opinion as an architect as to what the ADA says. Sometimes I might sound like an attorney today and talk out of both sides of my mouth. I will try to explain that when that comes up, but just keep that in mind. Also, if you need psychological assistance after listening to me, please go get professional help. Don't go self-medicate tonight in a bar or something like that. And just to clarify, I am a licensed architect in 29 states. Nevada is one of them. If I say I'm an architect, I'm only claiming to be an architect in one of those 29 states and not the states that I'm not registered in. So don't go turning me into anybody, please. So where do we start? Into the nitty gritty. So the first place I want to go to is some key definitions. So because like all good buildings, they have to have a good foundation. So we need a good foundation here. So primary function area. What is a primary function area? Because a lot of the ADA references primary function area. So a primary function area is a major activity for which the facility is intended. That's got a lot of open-endedness to it. The ADA is pretty good about telling us what is not primary functions, like mechanical rooms, boiler rooms, supply storage rooms, etc. If you'll notice the last one down there, restrooms is not a primary function area. But I can think of at least one building where restrooms may be a primary function area. And think about a roadside rest stop where the restrooms are the purpose for the building. So that's what the facility is intended for. So it's possible that restrooms could be a primary function area there. But some of the areas that are customer services, lobbies of a bank, dining areas and cafeterias, sales floors in retail facilities, things like that. So let's talk about a hotel real quick, because there's some good things about a hotel that kind of help clarify this a little bit. Let's say we've got a courtyard hotel that has a meeting room. So while we know that meeting rooms in a conference center are primary function areas, is that meeting room in that hotel, that courtyard hotel, is it a primary function area? I might say it's not, because that is not what the facility is intended for. That's more of a convenience type conference room. What about a pool? Well, again, a courtyard hotel has a pool, but is that a primary function? Maybe not. It's not necessarily black and white, but maybe it's not. Now let's go to a conference hotel that's got 40 or 50 conference rooms. Definitely that is a conference center. Therefore, the meeting rooms there are a primary function area. What about a resort hotel that's got a big pool along with it? Okay, now there's an example of what a primary function area there may be. The pool there is definitely a primary function area. So you can see how it's not necessarily all black and white, but it's something that you have to think about. So where does this kind of help come in? Path of travel or restrooms. What the standards tell us is that the path of travel to the altered area and restrooms, telephones, drinking fountains, etc., have to be brought into compliance in an alteration. But it's path of travel to the altered area and the restrooms. But does that include the restrooms? Well, according to the Department of Justice, it does. So if you're doing an alteration to a space, you have to bring the path of travel to that altered area in the compliance, as well as the restrooms that service that area. But let's talk about a two-story department store, and we're doing alterations on the second floor. So we're required to bring the toilets into compliance that serve that area. If we've got toilets on the second floor, those are going to have to be brought into compliance, but maybe not the first floor restrooms because they service the first floor. So that's kind of the difference that we're looking at when we're talking about restrooms and path of travel to altered areas of a primary function area. Again, this all goes back to primary function area. So what are we talking about here? The path of travel to the altered primary function area. That's going to first start at a bus stop, at the public right-of-way, at accessible parking spaces, to the entry to the building. So that's number one. Number two is the entry to the building. Number three, once we're in the building, that's going to be the path of travel to the primary function area that's altered, and then the toilet rooms that service that altered primary function area. So this is kind of an example of the order that we're going to apply those standards to. So what is readily achievable? Readily achievable is easily accomplishable and able to be carried out without much difficulty or expense. So in determining whether something is readily achievable or not, we have a series of factors that we have to look at. But the Department of Justice threw one at us, which is the overall financial resources of any parent corporation or entity. So whereas a mom and pop store may not be able to afford to do something that would make it not readily achievable, a corporation like Walmart literally has the resources to tear a building down and build it back from the ground up. Not a good business decision, but as far as the financial resources, they have that. So a large corporation, readily achievable is a very high standard to meet, whereas a mom and pop have a very low standard to meet something that's not readily achievable. But the thing that somebody needs to keep in mind, if you can't afford to fix it, what makes you think you can afford the lawsuit? Because those lawsuits are going to come anyway. And even though it might cost $3,500 to tear out a curb ramp, and it's determined to not be readily achievable, it's probably going to cost you that plus much more to defend against that lawsuit. So that's something that owners need to keep in mind when they're taking a look at readily achievable. Then we have technically infeasible. And that basically has little likelihood of being accomplished. So what does that mean? What's technically infeasible? Well, here's an example of a little toilet room that is not compliant. And the question is it technically infeasible to bring it into compliance? Well, we've got a minimum egress width corridor. We can't strengthen the width of that corridor. We certainly can't move the elevator shaft or the stairwell. So here's an example of a toilet room that has little likelihood of being accomplished. It's technically infeasible. But what do we have to do there? We have to change the things that we can in that toilet room to the maximum extent feasible. We could lower the lavatory to be at 34 inches in height. We could put grab bars in. We maybe can't make the 60 inches in the toilet room because we've got some kind of a shaft through the building that probably is a mechanical shaft or something that we can't change. But we can certainly put a water closet in that's at the right height. We can make sure that the door has proper opening force or closing speed if it's got a closer on it. But we certainly can't give the clear floor space that's required for that door. So therefore, it's usable by a larger majority of people, but not everyone. So what do? Now we have to put a sign outside of this toilet room directing people to the nearest fully accessible toilet room. That's what's required when you're using something that's technically infeasible. And then alterations. We've kind of gone through this. All of these are alterations and how you apply the standards to alterations. But what is an alteration? I think as architects, we have a definition that we use as an alteration, but it's not necessarily what the ADA says an alteration is. An alteration under the ADA is something that affects or could affect the usability of the building, facility, or space. So that could be changing out the flooring in a space, changing from carpet to a wood floor or wood floor to a carpet. That changes the usability of a space to a person with a disability because a person who uses a wheelchair has a harder time rolling across carpet than they do a hard surface floor. So that's the kind of usability that the ADA is talking about, not necessarily changing it from a conference room to an office or something like that. So again, activities that could affect the usability, carpet, changing tile floor to carpet, changing out a water closet or a sink, restriping a parking lot could affect the usability. But what they're talking about when we're talking about restriping a parking lot is not necessarily the maintenance that you do to repaint the existing parking lines. This would be where maybe you're out and you've had to resurface the parking lot and you're relaying out the parking spaces. That is restriping a parking lot at that point in time. And again, primary function area. We went through that a little bit more. So again, primary function area, what the facility is intended for, you have to make that analysis and determine whether something is a primary function area when you're doing an alteration for it. My advice would be always to err on the side of caution and look at it as a primary function area, but that's up to the owner to make that determination. It's up to the architect to help the owner make that determination. So the next thing we want to talk about is disproportionality. So there's a concept in the ADA talking about when we're doing a renovation to a primary function area, we have to bring the path of travel to that primary function area into compliance, but only to the extent that the cost does not exceed 20% of the overall alteration to the primary function area. So let's say we're going to do $100,000 renovation. Let me get back to where we were there. Let's say we're going to do a $100,000 renovation. What this means is that we may have to spend an additional $20,000. So our total renovation cost is $120,000 to bring the primary path of travel and the toilet rooms into compliance as part of this renovation. What this means is that once you reach that 20% threshold as part of that renovation, you can stop. However, that does not mean you do not have a continuing barrier removal obligation that tomorrow that you don't still need to remove barriers. So it's kind of a give and take area where, yeah, I can stop, but I still have a barrier removal obligation. So you may want to consider the fact that it may be less expensive to go above that 20% and do it now than to wait and get caught in a lawsuit later because you've got a barrier and you haven't removed that barrier. And then the thing that we need to remember is that we've had a barrier removal obligation since 1991. What's that, 32 years? So the question is, why do we still have buildings that have barriers in them? We should have been removing barriers all along, and it hasn't happened. So that's something that you also have to factor into that 20% alteration. So now some really meaty stuff here. Accessible routes. Let's get right down into the nitty-gritty of what the ADA requires. So where are accessible routes required? Side arrival points, at least one. We talked a little bit, public streets, transportation stops, accessible parking, accessible passenger loading zones. Within a site, between buildings on a site, electric vehicle charging stations on the site to the building, those are all places where accessible routes are required. And again, at least one. And I cannot tell you how many new buildings that we are continuing to see built today that there is no accessible route provided from the accessible entrance to the public right-of-way. And there's actually two reasons why that is required, because the building code also requires that you have an accessible route as part of the exiting system from the building to the public right-of-way. Within a building, multi-story buildings. Each story of a building has to be on an accessible route. But we do have an exception when the building is 3 stories or less. This is known as the elevator exemption. So as long as 3,000 square feet per story also. So buildings that are 3 stories or less, or buildings that have less than 3,000 square feet per story are not required to have accessible routes to all of the different stories. Exceptions are shopping centers, shopping malls, healthcare providers, terminals, depots, other stations. So there are some examples of where that's not true. 2-story or public building, 1 story with an occupant load of 5 or fewer persons. So again, 5 or fewer persons on that occupant load does not require an accessible route. And then there are 5 other exceptions, but they're really not common. So we didn't list those. You can go look those up at 206.2.3. And then spaces and elements within the building. Entrances to all accessible spaces have to be connected by a circulation path and an accessible route. And again, we go back to the multi-story building exemptions where that might not be a requirement. Employee work areas. Well, under the ADA, common use circulation paths within employee work areas are required to be accessible, but there are exceptions. Employee work areas that are less than 1,000 square feet. Common use circulation paths that are integral component of work area equipment. And then common use circulation paths within exterior employee work areas. So those are the exceptions. Otherwise, you need to make your common use circulation paths within employee work areas accessible. And then emergency exits, as I mentioned earlier, from the exit discharge to the public right-of-way is a requirement because the ADA references back to the International Building Code, and in Chapter 10 of the International Building Code, that's a requirement. And then again, others in 206.2, not so common that we deal with all the time, but make sure that you pay attention to those. Now, here's a building that may or may not have to have an accessible route from the public right-of-way, because we do have an exception. The first building was a travel plaza on a turnpike. And since pedestrian traffic is not allowed on the turnpike, you don't have people coming from the public right-of-way. So therefore, an exception is granted for not having an accessible route to the public right of way. Here's another one, this little brewing lab up in the space. You can see how far it is off the highway there. Again, you might not expect pedestrian traffic there. Now, here's an interesting one. Here is a little store, I guess we'll just call it a store, that's on this highway. Probably should have an accessible route to that highway, even though if you look at where that is located up there, it's way away from everything. So you're probably not going to have pedestrian traffic to that. So this is an example of where you may not have to have an accessible route to the building from the public right of way. But too often we see people trying to utilize this exception from a place that clearly could have pedestrian traffic. So it's best not to try to use it because it's a rare exception. So accessible routes, again, transit stops, accessible parking spaces, again, passenger loading zones to the building. And what's interesting is if you take a look at this sketch that is part of the access board's information, you will see that there are several things there that probably don't work, like the failure at the up near the transit stop. There's no curb ramp, so that parking space is actually not on an accessible route. So what is an accessible route? An accessible route is 36 inches minimum, with the exception that it can go down to 32 inches minimum for 24 inches max, as long as those reductions are at least 48 inches minimum apart. We also have 180-degree turns within an accessible route. So again, we have several options there. If the object that you're doing the turnaround is less than 48 inches, your accessible route has to be greater than 36 inches in width, as long as your turn itself is greater than 60. Or if it's less than 60 but greater than 48, then you have to have 42 inches. But the question is, this kind of looks like something you might see in a retail store where you're going around the retail shelving. Is that a 180-degree turn? No, in our opinion, it is not. A 180-degree turn is where you are forced to make the 180-degree turn. In a retail store, we would not consider that to be a 180-degree turn because you can actually go the other direction. So it's really two 90-degree turns because you have maneuvering space where you can maneuver back and forth and then make the turn. So one last attempt at where are we going to have accessible routes. We're going to have from public streets and sidewalks. So keep in mind, just because you don't have a sidewalk out in the public right of way does not mean you do not have to have an accessible route to the building. It says public streets and sidewalks. From the accessible parking spaces. Now here's one. What about to the dumpster area? My opinion is that an accessible route to the dumpster area is not required. But the Department of Justice is on record as saying that they expect to see an accessible route to the dumpster area. So therefore, our recommendation is provide it. It probably doesn't cost anything to provide it as part of the construction of a new building. But if you get caught later, it can be extremely expensive to try to install that later. And that is only an accessible route to the dumpster area. It doesn't mean that the dumpster area, the gates to the dumpster area have to be accessible. You just have to have an accessible route out to that area. So, and here is the exception of where an accessible route is definitely required to the dumpster area is when it has a covering over it. which we see some places, which is an attempt to keep water out of the dumpster area so that it doesn't take garbage and stuff carried out when it rains. Some examples of accessible routes, some good, some bad. Obviously, the upper one is showing an accessible route as it crosses a drive aisle right there. They use a different type of paper. That's not required. The ADA does not require those to be marked. There are a lot of jurisdictions that do, but the ADA does not require them to be marked. And as a matter of fact, there's been some studies that show marking those in drive aisles causes more people to be hit than less. So, you know, the question is, does the paint protect people or not? And I guess the idea is that paint probably makes people think, oh, I've got a clear path here, I'm protected, and when in reality they are not. The door on the lower left-hand corner right there, we'll see the door is on an accessible route, but we don't have the required 18-inch clearance on the strike side of the door. So that's a failure. The one on the lower right over there, there's a curb. So while that door is required to be on an accessible route, it's not, because there's a curb. So we do a lot of things that we think are compliant, then end up doing some small detail that makes them not requirements. So keep that in mind when you're watching these. Accessible route from the public right of way to the building entry. What does that mean? Well, here we're going to follow this accessible route from the public right of way all the way to the building. And you can see that we have a bunch of different elements. We have walking surfaces, we have curb ramps, we have ramps. Those are all pieces of the accessible route. Now we get into a curb ramp. There are lots of different things that make up a curb ramp. The things that we'll point out, we won't go through all the different layouts of a curb ramp, but things that we want to talk about is side flares. Under the ADA, side flares are not required on curb ramps unless a pedestrian can walk across the curb ramp. So in the second picture there on the bottom, obviously a pedestrian would not walk across that curb ramp, so side flares are not required. The one on the right, where it is in the middle of a sidewalk, pedestrians could walk across that, so therefore side flares would be required. And again, we have opportunities to do curb ramps that are built up, built in. We can also have parallel curb ramps like the one in the upper portion there. Those are legitimate curb ramps as well. And those may be better in a lot of cases. So you can still use those. You just have to remember that you have to have a clear landing at the bottom that's level, and you have to have landings on the tops of the curb ramps that are level as well. And the one on the far right we point out because oftentimes what we see is that the ramp will extend all the way down to that curved area. Well, the problem that you've got is that grade breaks at curb ramps need to be perpendicular to the path of travel. So you're going to have to break that curb ramp at that bottom edge and then have a level area out there that takes in that curb. So why do we see so many curb ramps that are too steep, not compliant? Are we as architects stupid and we design them wrong? I don't think so. Are contractors just bad at not getting them built correctly? I don't think so. But we tend to think that we have a 6-inch curb, so a curb ramp has to be 6 inches minimum in length. That's great, as long as we have a 0% slope that we're building that in. But what in reality we usually have is a slope along that sidewalk of 2%, let's say. And if it's a 2% slope, we're actually chasing grade. So that curb ramp has to be almost 8 feet in length to maintain a 1 in 12 maximum slope. And then think about that 36-inch minimum that you have to have across the top of it there. Now that sidewalk has to be almost 11 feet in depth. That is where I think most of the problems are caused, because the contractor goes out and builds a 6-foot curb ramp, but he matches it to the slope of the sidewalk, the cross slope of the sidewalk up there, and we end up with a curb ramp that therefore is too steep. This is just something that we're not properly considering, because it doesn't show up on a piece of paper well.
So Brad, we have a question.
Yes.
It says, are truncated domes required in legitimated curb ramps?
We're going to talk about detectable warnings there. Under the ADA, detectable warnings are not required on on private property, with the exception of train boarding platforms. That is the only place under the ADA that detectable warnings are required. And when you get to the public right-of-way, we now have the public right-of-way guidelines that do require detectable warnings in some locations. Need to take a look at that, because not every driveway where a sidewalk or a curb ramp goes across a driveway are detectable warnings required. But on private property, the ADA applies, and there are no detectable warnings required under the ADA. California, however, does require it. But I'm not aware of any other state or jurisdiction that requires detectable warnings anywhere on site, with the exception of California. So I hope that answers the question. So what's wrong with this curb ramp? It looks like it's sloped right. It's got side flares that look like they're okay, but this curb ramp is not compliant. Why is that? Well, there's actually two reasons. The first reason is that the ground surface of the access aisle and the parking spaces is required to be 2.1% max, 1 in 48. Once we put that curb ramp and those side flares in there, which extends into the parking space and the access aisle, is that not greater than 1 in 48? Therefore, it's not compliant. The second reason is that it specifically states that curb ramps and flared sides of curb ramps shall be located such that they do not project into vehicular traffic lanes or parking spaces or parking access aisles. But we still see this being built today because we're missing those two reasons right there. So don't do this anymore. So let's take a look at some examples of some curb ramps, some good, some bad. And as you can tell, these are being provided with detectable warnings, but it was not required, but they're still being placed there. So I would encourage people to think about that and not over install detectable warnings. They're maintenance issues. They can then become trip and fall hazards, which trip and fall hazards are much more expensive than ADA lawsuits. So that's something that we want to avoid. Okay, so we see that picture in the middle. That is a good example, pretty good example of how you put a curb ramp in, you do the grade break right there, and then you have that level surface at the bottom that's outside of the drive aisle. The one on the bottom right is a really bad example of how that one was done, because it doesn't have the level area at the bottom. The upper left is kind of a half curb ramp of a parallel or a half parallel curb ramp. That's perfectly acceptable. The one in the upper right is a parallel curb ramp, but again, detectable warnings are not required. Here's an example of a curb ramp. This one actually is in California, so the detectable warning was required in California. That everything is compliant. but it's a bad design. And I think we can see that there was a definite problem there because people, they put these warning cones up there. One of two things happened here is a person walking down the sidewalk didn't catch the fact that you had that break in the grade there, and they twisted their ankle, or somebody walking across the crosswalk right there didn't see the step and tripped and went headfirst into the glass. We've seen this a lot, and then we've seen the solution trying to come back after the fact. So we need to pay attention to safety aspects as well, even though the ADA itself is not necessarily a safety code. There are some things that we as architects need to pay attention to. So ramps, we talked about curb ramps, we talked about ramps. There is a very definite distinction between curb ramps and ramps. Curb ramps in no situations require handrails. Ramps could require handrails. If the slope of a ramp is greater than 6 inches, or rise is greater than 6 inches, you have to have handrails. Curb ramps could have a rise of 24 feet, and it doesn't require a handrail. So what is a curb ramp versus what is a ramp? A curb ramp is a ramp that cuts through a curb. A ramp does not cut through a curb. It's just that simple. So handrails, as we talked, if it's greater than 6 inches in rise, it does not require, or it does require a handrail. There used to be a stipulation that if the ramp had a run of a certain length, it had to have a handrail. Well, that just so happened to match the rise of 6 inches. So now that we just shorten it to 6 inches. So we can have a ramp that say slopes at 7% instead of 8.3%. It still doesn't get quite to a 6-inch rise, but the ramp itself is longer. So the distinction is we would rather have a longer ramp with a more shallow rise, or more shallow slope, whereas the rise is the same because it's easier to navigate. But the quick thing to remember is 6 inches for handrails. But then we're required to have handrail extensions on a ramp at the top and the bottom. It's going to extend horizontally above the landing for 12 inches minimum. So we see in the lower right-hand corner and the upper left-hand corner, we see where it extends horizontally in the direction of travel. We see the one on the left, it did not. So that ramp at the lower left has a handrail extension, but it doesn't extend in the direction of travel. So it is not compliant, with the exception, number 3, if that were an alteration and it would have created a hazard, then you could do it that way. But we see that tried to be installed way too many times when the ramp itself could be readjusted such that you don't have it extend into a sidewalk or something and become hazardous. But how do we measure that?
Oh,
yes.
Brad, I have this. I don't know if this is a comment or a question, so I'm going to throw it to you. It says, confirm that a slope of 5% or less is not a ramp.
That is correct.
Okay.
Ramps are defined as slopes greater than 5%, maximum of 8.3%. Anything that is 5% or less is considered just a walking surface itself. So that's the definition between a walking surface and a ramp. A ramp is always greater than 5%.
And then one other question, does the handrail extension have to float above the finished floor?
Can you repeat that?
Yes. Does the handrail extension have to float above the finished floor?
I'm not sure what that's referring to, but it has to be the same height above the floor as the handrail. So, what's that, 34 to 38 inches above. We usually see them about 36 inches. So as the slope comes down at 36, then it turns and it is parallel to the surface at 36 inches on that extension of that landing. It is required to return to a wall or the ground, either one, or to a post. So one of those three things, that handrail is required to return to something. So it can't just stop out there at the end. It's got to have some kind of return. And that's what we're kind of talking around here, the return. So we oftentimes see the extensions are not measured properly. They're the 12 inches is at any kind, stops at any kind of curved or surface or a surface where it stops. So in the upper right hand corner, you can see we've got a 90-degree return back to a wall, and at the bottom it actually has a 90-degree turn down to the ground or return to a post. The handrail extension is measured to the inside face of that. Where you're using a curved surface, like on the left-hand side, you have to start the handrail extension where that curve starts, whether it goes down or whether it's returning to a wall. So that actually makes that extension more than 12 inches in total length because of where you start measuring it from. And that's something that we see as a violation a lot. This is getting missed over and over and over again. So hopefully that might clue us in a little bit about when you're talking about whether it floated or not. It does have to return to a wall, the ground, or a post. And here is an example of both of these are returning back to a post, and you're seeing that curved surface of where you're going to start measuring from. So let's move on to doors here real quick. So doors. I'm not going to go through all the different variations of door approaches. You're going to have to look those up, but just keep in mind that there are variations, and you need to pay attention to how do you approach the door. If you can get a forward approach or a front approach to that door, I might advise that you look at that, because a person who uses a wheelchair would most likely prefer a forward approach because it's easier to use the door. So it's much easier to use that door, so they're going to prefer that. But you might also want to think about using the predominant approach to that door. Is it a forward approach, a latch approach, or a hinge approach? That's a designer's choice. And you only have to have it from one side, not both sides or all three when you're looking at this, but choose the predominant side. But again, with closers, without closers, changes the depth, the width of those, whether it's interior, exterior, can change it as well for the latch side approach. Just keep in mind that you have different variations of that theme. The thing that we see missed a lot is recessed doors. So a recessed door or gate is required to have a forward approach. If there's an obstruction within 18 inches, that's more than 8 inches in depth. And you need to be paying attention, because casework or other fixed elements can also create a recessed door situation. So here's some examples of a recessed door. And the best example that I can use is that if you determined what the door maneuvering clearance is, and it is greater than 8 inches from the face of the door because of some wall condition or fixture condition, then you've got a violation, period. That door maneuvering clearance needs to always be 8 inches or less from the face of the door. And if you can meet that condition, you really don't need to worry about recessed doors, with the exception of whether it's a forward approach or not. So how do you fix it? you notch the wall. That's what you're doing. And that's what we're talking about. Make sure that's always less than 8 inches, 8 inches or less, actually. So then your maneuvering clearance will always be compliant and you don't have to worry about it. And pull side, push side, same thing. Just keep those all in mind right there. Maneuvering clearance, again, less than or equal to 8 inches. Then you don't have to try to determine whether it's a recessed door or not. It's just going to comply because you've got the proper maneuvering clearance at that door. More examples. And then we talked about items that can create recessed door conditions, like a fire extinguisher, alarm pads on doors. Technically, a light switch could create that condition because you've got that light switch that sticks out and a quarter of an inch. Luckily, everybody has some common sense, and we don't worry about light switches. But technically, it could be highly technically could be create a recessed door condition.
Brad, we have a question.
Yes.
It says, if there is not a jam, so the door swings either way, do the same rules apply?
So we're talking about a double swing door here. People would prefer a push door than a pull door because, again, they're usually much easier to use. So we always look at a double acting door as a push door. And so therefore it only has to meet one condition. It does not have to meet both the push and the pull. So we just look at it as a push door and have it comply with the push door condition. So I hope that answers the question. If not, throw another question up there and we'll go into more detail. Places where we see door maneuvering spaces that are not compliant in their midst is in toilet rooms, where the door to a toilet compartment is a door and it has to have the proper maneuvering clearances. And we see lavatories like on the left-hand side within that space. The one in the middle, it shows how wall conditions could create a situation where you don't have the proper maneuvering clearance. The one on the right, we have a situation where you have those little far outs that defines the corridor, and that could be within the maneuvering clearance of that door. The question that you would want to ask yourself, is that door a latch approach, or is that door a forward approach or a front approach? If you've got the maneuvering clearance to make that a forward approach, you're fine. If you don't, then it becomes a barrier because that space that is within the door clearance of that door maneuvering clearance of that door. Looking at some examples within toilet rooms of doors where we have maneuvering clearance issues. The one on the bottom left is good. The one on the upper right or the bottom right is not, because you've got a trash can and a lavatory that interferes with that door maneuvering clearance. And we forget about those in toilet rooms all the time. Other places, other things we see drinking fountains that are placed in alcoves. Well, those are interfering with the door maneuvering clearance on that door, because as you can see in that far right-hand picture, it projects out into that door opening a little bit. Things to watch for. Trash cans on the inside of doors. There is a theory that's been promoted out there, and I will tell you that the Access Board still tells us it's valid, that if you turn the building upside down and the element falls out, it is not covered under the ADA. Okay, that's great. However, that does not mean that element cannot still create a barrier. So here we've got a situation where we've got a trash can in that center section that's within the door maneuvering clearance. So it does create a barrier. So we need to watch for that. And where that happens a lot is at toilet room doors where people want to use the towels to open the door to use the door handle, so they don't have to actually touch the door handle. So we have owners who actually put them there. Maybe as architects, we can design a solution so that doesn't become a problem there. Again, equipment. This is a piece of fixed equipment that's created a recessed door contusion for this door right here. As architects, we may not have total control over that, but we ought to think about it if we're building the space for that piece of equipment to go into. Again, the one on the left is a trash can that does interfere with the clear floor space for that door. On the right there was done well, where the furniture was planned for, so it did not create a barrier at that door. And then door and gate opening forces. 5 pounds max for all sliding and folding doors, whether it be interior or exterior door. For hinged doors, it's 5 pounds max, only on interior hinged doors. An exterior hinged door has, under the ADA, has no requirement for opening force. And the reason for that is you've got a big wind blowing against that door. It doesn't matter. That door could even not have a closer on it and create more than 5 pounds pressure. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this. And also keep in mind that from 90 degrees to 12 degrees, if the door has a closer, it's a 5 seconds minimum closing speed on that door. And those do need to be checked, because as weather changes, mechanical door closers do change, and that's a maintenance issue constantly. And I will tell you that a mechanical closer is the element that's usually attached to a door. Spring hinges are not closers, are not door closers. So those do not apply to this. This is only when you have a door closers itself.
Brad, I have some questions.
Yes.
Okay. Aren't there different rules at toilet stall doors?
As far as maneuvering clearances, no, there are not. The same maneuvering clearances apply to toilet compartment doors.
Okay.
The issue.
Sorry, go ahead. I have another question after you're done.
Okay. The issue that is kind of ignored, because we asked this question and everybody kind of go, oops, we didn't think about that. While the door maneuvering clearances are required at toilet compartment doors, if you design the minimum toilet compartment door, or toilet compartment itself, the door maneuvering clearance, the water closet does extend into the maneuvering clearance of that door. And the response that we got back from the access board was, we just ignore that. So as long as it's only the water closet itself that extends into that, we ignore that. Otherwise, you want to make sure that you do have the correct door maneuvering clearance for any toilet compartments. Okay, next question.
Okay, the other question is, how are door opening forces tested and enforced?
Fish scales. There is a device that you can buy out there that you use to measure the force of a door. I want to say they probably cost about $35. It's basically a glorified fish scale is what it is. You can go down and buy a cheap fish scale and it will probably suffice. But I wouldn't want to defend a lawsuit with that. I would want a better device. The thing that you do is that we always do on the push side of the door, because it's just easier to measure. And you hold the device on the edge of the door. You start the door to open, and then you measure the force. You don't have to measure the force from the door in a 100% closed position, because you have inertia to overcome. And then you push all the way to a 90-degree point and then you take your maximum reading there. And usually they have a little O-ring that measures and will push that to the maximum measurement. Or you could buy a $500 device to measure the door opening with, but we're not aware of anybody who uses those. So hope that answers the question. If not, fire us another question. Door opening widths. We have projections allowed of up to 4 inches, above 34 inches, and 2 inches at the top. And basically what those are intended to take into consideration is panic hardware on a door that does stick out a couple inches from the face of the door, and door closers that do extend down from the top of the door itself. So while a door clearance is required to be 80 inches max or minimum in height, and 32 inches minimum in width, you can extend up to 4 inches as long as it's above 34 inches or 2 inches down from the top. And we have seen a lot of complaints over door closers and door stops, but this is the way that you use to defend against those complaints. Doors and
sorry, Brad, we have another question.
Okay.
What is your opinion on having a recessed door in a historic renovation project where it is infeasible to meet code without damaging the historic structure?
Punt. There are exceptions for historic buildings that you do not necessarily have to provide accessibility at that particular location if it is going to destroy the historic nature of the building or that element. So that's something that you work with the historic preservation committee that's overseeing the historic aspects of the building as to what exactly you do. You know, a lot of courthouses are historic courthouses. And so you end up putting the accessible route into that courthouse at the rear of the building so it doesn't destroy the historic nature of the front of the courthouse. So those are the kind of things that you do. You move it to a different location. The other thing that we see a lot is we'll see automatic door openers used. There's a concept called equivalent facilitation. The idea is to provide the greatest amount of access as possible, while automatic door openers and operators are not required in the standard. Whereas a lot of people think they are not required. They do help get around requirements such as door opening force, such as maneuvering space clearances, those kind of things, because you just don't require the clearances if you have those type of elements. But again, it's equivalent facilitations. You have to be able to explain why it's equivalent access and be able to defend that if somebody files a complaint. And so it's difficult. Yes, go ahead.
Does this only apply to the classified historic buildings?
That is my understanding. Yes, it has to be registered, a registered historic building. We can't just say it's historic and try to get around it. It does have to be registered historic building. So, doors in series. I think we're all probably familiar with doors in series. Basically vestibules. Some people have tried to apply this to doors at the ends of corridors where you've got doors across from each other, but those are not necessarily doors in series because you're not forced to go through both doors. You might, but you're not forced to. Whereas in a vestibule, you're forced to go through both doors in series. The question we've started seeing a lot of vestibules where the doors are not in alignment with each other. When the doors are in alignment with each other, you have to have 48 inches between the door in the fully open position and the opposite door. but we're seeing doors that are not in alignment with each other. And the question is, well, how do I measure that? There is an intent out there that you need a 30 by 48 clear floor space outside of the door swings. But if you read the actual language of the standard, it says that you will have a minimum of 48 inches between the door and plus the width of the door. So if we look at the left-hand vestibule, we could make a claim that that 7 feet is what is required right there. Because now we have a 36-inch door plus 48 inches between the doors. We could look at the one on the right and same thing. We have a 7-foot distance there. I don't think that that is the proper way to do that, even though that's exactly what the language does say. I think this is the way we want to look at it. If we have doors that are in alignment with each other, we open the door and then we have 48 inches. That makes the vestibule 7 feet in depth. If they're not in alignment with each other, we make sure that the door itself, the door swing, is 48 inches from the other door. So what we're actually doing is we're measuring the 7 feet from the hinge side of the door, not the latch side of the door. This is what we do, and this is what we check, how we check for enforcement. And it does make the vestibules smaller. If you go back and you look at the other configurations, you'll see that the square footage of the vestibules actually do end up being smaller when you do it that way. So that's what we recommend. So that's kind of the end of doors. So if anybody has any more door questions, go ahead and throw them up there and we'll be happy to answer them. Let's look at protruding objects real quick. So these are things that are missed out there. And the question is, what is a protruding object? A protruding object is anything that extends greater than 4 inches more than 27 inches above the floor. So how do you measure that? The one on the left, it is not a protruding object because is a protruding object because it extends at where you measure 27 inches above the floor, it extends greater than 4 inches. The one on the right would not be a protruding object, even though it's almost designed the exact same way, because when you go to 27 inches, it only extends out 3 inches. So you can see it's a very nuanced detail that you're looking at and how you measure those protruding objects. But what are protruding objects, and what do we see that gets missed out there all the time? The one on the left is a water flow gong for a sprinkler system. That is actually a protruding object because it extends out greater than 4 inches. It gets missed. We had a sign out there that was actually 8 inches off the face of that wall. It was a protruding object. We came up with a unique solution by putting bike racks in front of it, which created a cane detection area. So therefore, it was no longer a protruding object. Fire extinguishers within a building on columns could end up being a protruding object. Signs can become a protruding object. Shelving can become a protruding object. In stairwells, valves on sprinkler systems, sprinkler risers could become a protruding object. Drinking fountains can become protruding objects. And the question here is, protruding objects apply to circulation paths, not necessarily just accessible routes. Everything is a circulation path where you walk or maneuver. Not every circulation path is an accessible route, but every accessible route is a circulation path. So protruding objects apply to circulation paths, which means every accessible route, but it goes beyond accessible route. Just because it's not an accessible route does not mean you don't have to pay attention to protruding objects. So you've got handrails that are protruding objects. You could have something like in a bathroom, a paper towel dispenser or a hand dryer that becomes a protruding object. Lavatories in toilet rooms could become a protruding object depending upon how you approach it. So here's an example on the left that very easily could be a protruding object, because as you approach it, is the bottom edge of that lavatory greater than 27 inches. The hand dryer is a protruding object. On the right, if you approach that lavatory from the front, it's not necessarily a protruding object. It's when it's along the circulation path. So within toilet rooms, what are we looking for in toilet rooms? These are about the minimum size of toilet rooms that we have to address. But one of the things that we see often is we will again see elements like paper towel dispensers that are placed within the clear floor space of the doors. So you do want to pay attention to that. Again, this is almost the smallest toilet room that you could devise. But one of the things that we should all know is that turning spaces with a 60-inch diameter turning radius are required in toilet rooms. But what we forget is that we're allowed to use T-turns. And we never see T-turns used in design, but they actually can help make spaces smaller in properly designed spaces. So don't forget to use T-turns. You can use T-turns. The one thing that will tell you, under the new ANSI standards, I say new ANSI standards, they've been out since 2017. They're the newest ANSI standards, and we're now starting to see building codes adopt those because they were finally adopted in the 2021 IBC standards. Is turning radiuses went from 60 inches to 67 inches, and T-turns became a little bigger as well. So you need to pay attention to that. So we overlaid the two. So what does the 27 ANSI require versus what does the 2010 ADA standards require? And you can see how the 2017 ANSI in the green is all a little bit bigger than the requirements for the 2010 ADA standards, which was in the blue. But we did take a look at how does that change the size of a toilet room. And under the 2017 ANSI, we discovered that it really didn't impact the size of the room is if you are using a T-turn as opposed to the 67-inch diameter turning space. If you use a 67-inch diameter turning space, that toilet room does get bigger. And you need to keep in mind that toilet room itself, when you have a trash can in there, you need to make sure that stays outside of the clear floor spaces for all of your fixtures and your doors and your turning space and all of that in there. And you can see there's just a very little area over there where that can now be placed.
Oh, Brad, we have a
same
couple
thing
questions.
for this room. Yes.
Okay. Says, we get asked to provide executive restrooms inside an office for a client's personal use. Do these also need to meet the accessibility standards? Clients often want to minimize the size of these as much as possible.
There is an exception for private toilet rooms accessed only through private offices. Essentially, they have to be adaptable. So you can't necessarily make them smaller because you still have to have the clear floor space for those, but there are you don't have to have grab bars in them, but the lavatories have to be the correct heights, the water closets have to be at the correct heights, the doors can swing out as long as the doors themselves, whether you accommodate space within it, or you can reverse the swing of the door to swing out. So while there is an exception, it doesn't necessarily change the size of that space. That's what I would tell you, but there is an exception.
And then also, is it okay to have a protruding object like a sconce light above the toilet since it's not in a circulation path?
Essentially, yes, because the water closet itself moves the circulation path. If it's on the sidewall, I might not have a problem with it. If it's on the back wall, technically it's still okay. But what you want to watch for, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, is it could be a headbanger for somebody who's sitting down on the water closet, and you don't want their back of their head to hit that because it could cause a lot of damage to the back of somebody's head.
And then we have one more question. Does
Okay.
a standalone 2-story health club require an elevator?
Does a standalone 2-story health club require an elevator? I think there is an elevator exemption allowable because it's 3 stories or less. The question that you would want to, the thing that you would have to do is that you would have to make sure that all of the functions that are available on the second floor are available on the first floor. So while you don't have to go to the second floor, you have to have availability of all the functions on the first floor. So that's what you would have to do.
Okay, and that's all our questions right now.
Okay, great. Then I will continue on. So here are some layouts. I won't go through all the details on these. You should go through these. We've kind of tried to lay out where we think everything should be when you're looking at a toilet room. Best practices. For instance, grab bars have to be between 33 inches to 36 inches by the ADA standards to the top of the grab bar. That's the top of the grab bar, not the center line of the grab bar. Top of the grab bar, right? We recommend that the dimension be on our drawings be 35 inches. That allows the contractor to be off a little bit and still be within that 36-inch height range. Also, if the grab bar misreads the plans and he puts it 35 inches to the center line of the grab bar, because the grab bar is a 1.5 inch grab bar, he's still at 35 3/4 inches. So again, he's still less than 36 inches. This helps the contractor be successful. We recommend using a 48-inch grab bar on the sidewall. The requirement is a 42-inch grab bar, but we recommend a 48-inch grab bar. And as you can see, we place it exactly, or we place it 8 inches off the rear wall. It has to be 12 inches or less, but it also has to extend 54 inches minimum. 12 plus 42 is 54. If you're using a 42-inch grab bar, that grab bar has to be placed perfectly to meet both of those requirements. With a 48-inch grab bar, you place it at 8 inches. Now you're at 56 inches. So you're giving the contractor better opportunity to be compliant. Along the rear wall, we take the 42-inch grab bar off the sidewall. Instead of using a 36-inch grab bar on the rear wall, we use the 42-inch grab bar there, and we place the 42-inch grab bar always at 4 inches off the sidewall. If the water closet is 16 inches off of the water closet is required to be 16 to 18 inches. If it's placed at 16 inches, 17 inches, or 18 inches, that 4 inches works every single time. If you're using a 36-inch grab bar, now that grab bar has to be relocated depending upon, or placed exactly on the center line of that water closet. So there's no definite dimension. So we've discovered that the difference in cost between those grab bars is $6. And we think it's well worth it to help the contractor be successful. But this is just some ideas of how to place things so that you're in compliance with both the ADA standards and the ANSI standards in all conditions.
Okay,
Let's
Brad.
talk about,
Oh,
yes.
got another question before you start on water closets. How far can the door swing overlap the circulation turning circle or T?
Under the ADA, there is no maximum distance. The turning circle can go all the way up to the door, and the door can swing 36 inches over it. In California, there is a 12-inch maximum, but under the ADA and under the ANSI standards, there is no maximum. But keep in mind that under the ADA, a door cannot swing over any fixture clear floor spaces unless there is a 30 by 48 clear floor space outside of the swing of the door, which usually is pretty easy to get, but you just have to make sure that that's there. So again, ADA, no maximum. Under California, there is a 12-inch maximum.
Okay, another one. Is a vertical grab bar required?
Under the ADA, a vertical grab bar is not required. That is an ANSI standard requirement. So keep in mind, as you're doing buildings, you may be under the requirements of both the ADA and the building code, which requires ANSI. Building departments do not enforce the ADA. They enforce their building code. They are enforcing ANSI. Under the ADA, that is a federal requirement, and it's enforced by the federal government or the courts. Also, I will throw this out. We had a complaint a while back claiming that vertical grab bar interfered with the horizontal grab bar because the ADA didn't require it. And the Access Board and the Department of Justice have both said grab bars cannot interfere with other grab bars. So that was a bogus complaint. So you don't have to worry about if somebody says that. Yeah, maybe you just have to convince them that they're wrong, but it's not true. It's not a requirement. Water closets. On the left is what the ADA standard requires. On the right is our recommendations of how to approach that. We have found on the right, if you do that, we have far less issues getting the contractor to build it correctly. And so instead of giving the contractor requirement of 16 to 18 inches off the center line of the water closet, we tell them to place it at 17 inches. Now the contractor has a dimension to meet. And if he's a little bit off, he's still compliant. And I will point out that while the ADA is 16 to 18 inches, the state of California is 17 to 18 inches. And because Nevada, you probably work a lot in California, it is a little different in California out there. Sidewalls, again, left is the requirement. On the right is our recommendation. The one thing I'll point out here is the seat cover dispenser that you see there. That's a good location for that. We see that placed on the wall above the grab bar, above the water closet itself. You can't get to it. So that is a violation. So you can either place it on that wall there, which works well, or you can place it on the sidewall as well, but not above the water closet. Another example, and the sanitary napkin disposal unit, that is the correct location for that. The ADA does not specify where it needs to go, but that's where you do want to place it. California actually says it has to be there, but that's a good location because it's reachable. The reason for the toilet paper dispenser being 7 to 9 inches in front of the water closet is because you don't want to have a person have to reach out in front of them and fall off of the water closet because they don't have balance. So you want it all within a good compact reach range right there. Let's look at some water closets quickly. The one on the left is not compliant because the flush valve is not on the wide side, as we can see. Interestingly enough, this was a 2-bedroom suite. And you see the other picture right there, and it was not compliant because it was on the wrong side. We see this all the time in toilet rooms where they get the water closet switched between toilet rooms. So neither one of them are requirement. And funny, we've even got into toilet rooms that they put both 48-inch grab bars in one at one water closet and both 42-inch grab bars at the other one. How that happens, I don't know. Picture on the bottom right there. We don't know what they were thinking, but I guess, is that the proverbial throne that we keep talking about, right? The porcelain throne. The upper picture, anybody have any idea what somebody was thinking there? Yeah, I mean, you can see some really strange stuff getting built out there. Toilet compartments. Keep in mind, these are not toilet stalls. These are toilet compartments. If you want to be politically correct language, stalls are for animals, compartments are for people. So you're required to have a path of travel to the door of 42 inches clear minimum. If the door swings in, you're good. If the door swings out, you're now required to have an 18-inch minimum clear floor space, so that space becomes wider. That's why most of the time doors do swing in. There are some state codes out there that do require the door to always swing out, so pay attention to that. Make sure that you keep fixtures and elements outside of the required clear floor space for the doors. This happens to be a California standard. California, instead of 42 inches, is 44. Why they think they need a little bit extra room, I don't know, but the ADA is still 42 inches clear. You're required to have a minimum clear floor space on the inside of a toilet compartment, but you're also required to have a toe space underneath the partition that's 9 inches minimum and extends 6 inches outside the front and one side. So when we start seeing toilet compartments that go all the way to the ground, you have to actually make your toilet compartments bigger. That 6 inches has to be incorporated on the inside of the toilet compartment. We see this missed a lot because it's in a slightly different section. So people make their toilet compartment the minimum size. They're missing the 6-inch toe clearance requirement. So again, the door, if the door swings in, cannot overlap the required clear floor space of the water closet. That's so when you're at the end of the stall like that, swinging it in, the compartment has to get a little bigger probably. Again, floor mounted water closets versus wall mounted water closets, 56 to 59 inches.
Okay, Brad, I've got a couple questions if we can jump in.
Yes, ma'am, please
Okay.
do.
We do a lot of TIs. Can we take the existing building exception to reduce our turning radius? It's new space in an existing building. And this PS, I like your old school sketches.
Okay. Under the ADA, there is no difference between existing and new. Under the ANSI standards, there is existing, under the new ANSI standards, existing buildings fall under the old sizes and new buildings fall under the new standards.
Okay, another one.
This is a very fine point. If you look at the definition of a new building and existing building, and this is my attorney speak right here because I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth. I would advise you to use the new standards if you have gutted the interior of that building. If you have not gutted the interior of the building, you are very definitely safe to use the existing building standards. But if you've gutted it, you really have a hard argument for why you couldn't use the larger standards. And I think it's my opinion that that's actually what the standards say, but that's not what most people believe. Now, you can't get sued over the ANSI standards. Only the building department can enforce it. And so if you can convince the building official of that, and if he's the one that's telling you it has to be bigger, that's where you want to go with it. He's the one that you're going to have to convince.
Okay, the next one. Can
yes.
I put a baby changing station behind the door? So when the door is closed, it's accessible, but not when the door is swinging open.
There is nothing that says that where a baby changing table can be located, with the exception that it cannot be in the clear floor space of the water closet. It can overlap the clear floor space of every other element in the room. So it technically could be behind a door. If it's a multi-user toilet room, you probably definitely don't want to put it there, because somebody's going to open that door while you're there trying to use it. In a single user toilet room, a person is going to have to put the baby changing table up to leave the room. So you're probably pretty safe to say that it's going to work there, and they can lock the door so somebody's not going to hit them. In reality, we see a lot of baby changing stations that don't stay up. And so you could end up with a problem with somebody puts it up, they leave the room, and then that table falls down, and then you can't get into the toilet room. That's a real possibility. So while it might not be a good idea, I don't think there's any violation or prohibition against it.
Okay, we have a few more questions, but I know you've got some more slides to get through. So I'm going to hold the questions until the end, if that's okay, to make sure we get through the presentation.
That's fine with me.
Okay. And then we'll see what we can take at the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. So examples of where you've got walls that go all the way to the bottom, you can clearly see that they did not take into account where the walls went to the floor, that you needed the extra space. Door latches, without tight twisting, pinching, and turning. The one on the left is a good example of one that does work, because it doesn't take tight pinching, twisting, and turning for the door latch itself. On doors in toilet compartments, you're required to have a U-shaped handle on the inside and the outside of the door both now. So you need to pay attention to that. We see those missed a lot in construction. Ambulatory compartments. Ambulatory compartments are required when you have 6 or more fixtures required. Not necessarily that you provide 6 fixtures, but when you are required to have 6 fixtures, then you have to have an ambulatory compartment. And they're a little different now than what they were in the old standards. So you need to pay attention to those. The question that we always get asked is the water closet. Does it have to be 17 to 19 inches above the floor? Our opinion is that is not what is required, because in a toilet room, only one water closet is required to comply, and that better be the one that's in the accessible toilet compartment. So that complies. The ambulatory requirements do not reference the water closet section. It has its own section that tells you about the grab bars and so on and so forth. Is it the right thing to do? You bet it is, because that's probably more than any place else where the 17 to 19 inches height is going to come in handy for a person who's trying to use that water closet. So should you? Yes. Is it a requirement? No, it is not. Examples of a ambulatory water closet or toilet compartment with the water closet in it. So here's an example of where the toilet paper dispenser can be behind the water closet because you don't have all the requirements for the water closets. And the toilet paper dispenser in this location doesn't have the requirements because you're not going back to the water closet requirements, which is where the toilet paper dispenser requirements are located. So again, different elements, but you do have to watch the coat hook because that is an accessible coat hook. It would have to be at 48 inches max. And that is a reach range issue, not a control issue. Lavatories, knee and toe clearance are what we're primarily concerned with here. This is what the knee and toe clearance requirements are. This is what it looks like when you put it under a lavatory. This is what happens when you install the drain pipe. And as you can see, that interferes with the knee toe clearance. That is a failure. Every single time, that is a failure. That's the biggest problem that we have. So you need to pay attention to that. There's several options to get away with that. Depending upon how far back the drain pipe is, will tell you how high that drain pipe needs to be. So if it's 9 inches back, it needs to be 21 inches above the floor to keep out of the knee and toe clearance. That's pure geometry is all that is. However, if you put an offset drain pipe in and you move the drain pipe to the back, that solves that problem every single time. You just have to make sure that the contractor actually installs it correctly, because we've got a client that requires that in every location. And oftentimes the contractor, while he installs it, he extends it directly to the side so it doesn't move the drain pipe out of the clear floor space. So again, there's the offset for the clear floor space where you see it move back. It gets out of the knee toe clearance. Also, the other thing to pay attention to is that when you're reaching for the handles of your faucets, you cannot extend past the toe space. So while the reach range may say it could be 25 inches back, if you don't have 25 inches of toe space, you cannot do that. So you have to watch that to make sure that wherever your toe space ends, that your handles for your faucets are within that reach range. And then we have to talk about covering the pipes or whatever. A lot of people think that's insulation and they only put it on the hot side. That's not correct. It is a protection against sharp objects. So you have to watch for other sharp objects that may be under lavatories, like perhaps that hose bib that's under there could be a sharp object, and maybe it ought to be covered as well. But just some examples of what we see out there. Again, you can put a shroud on, you can put coverings, all sorts of different ways to do that. The one on the upper left there, we're not quite sure what that was. Maybe that was the Goldilocks, the three bears, where you have the baby bear, the mama bear that's just right, and the papa bear that's too high. We just don't know. One on the bottom left, that is airport, and so they had to raise the lavatory to get it to compliant, not lower it, which is what you usually have to do. And again, if you're doing something where the lavatory itself is resting on a counter, keep in mind it's not the counter that's 34 inches maximum in height. It is the top edge of the lavatory that is 34 inches. And so that was a miss. And our guess is that the architect designed one thing and the interior designer did something different, and it just failed to be coordinated. And the lower middle is, again, the shroud, but it was installed incorrectly by the contractor. Probably he couldn't get it installed correctly because of the drain pipe, and it just ended up not having the 8 inches deep at 27 inches high. Mirrors are 40 inches minimum in height. I'm sorry, 40 inches maximum in height to the reflecting surface. So you have to pay attention to that. Here's a mirror in this toilet room that is clearly above 40 inches, so it's not compliant. But if you can see, they've got a full height mirror or close to full height mirror, and that is 35 inches maximum height when you have a full height mirror. But only one of them needs to be accessible, not both mirrors need to be accessible. Accessories, our recommendation is that you put them at 46 inches across the board, whereas 48 inches max to the operating point. And so you have to determine what the operating point is of each individual element. And then again, 15 inches minimum to whatever the operating point is. We would recommend 24 inches minimum, just to make sure that it's not all the way down on the floor. But whether it be a handle, the eye on a automatic dispenser of some kind, those all placed at the 48 inches max. And here's where we were talking about earlier. You were talking about the wall sconce. There's no specific prohibition against that shelf on that rear wall back there. But what you do have is when people sit on that water closet, particularly a person who maybe has a disability and doesn't have total control of their body, they swing back and they bang their head on that shelf right across the back and cut themselves. That could be a very dangerous situation. So you need to watch that situation. That shelf does need to be within the reach ranges, and that's what creates the problem. Middle picture right there, you see the seat cover dispenser. You don't have the required clear floor space for the seat cover dispenser because the water closet is hindering it. There on the right, you see the right place to put it because now you've got the clear floor space for the seat cover dispenser. Coat hooks, 48 inches. One on the left clearly doesn't comply. Middle, good. The one on the right, they put 2 in. So you've got a choice. Other things you have to watch for: tight twisting, pinching, grasping for controls. Where you put soap dispensers and paper towel dispensers and hand dryers, they need to make sure that they're within reach ranges and have the proper clear floor space requirements there. Soap dispensers also have a 5-pound force operating on them, so you have to watch that. We had a 4-hour meeting one day over soap dispensers trying to find one that would meet the 5-pound requirement for a client. Let me tell you, those are not fun meetings. The one in the middle is an example of some new stuff out there. I guess it works just fine. And on the right, mechanical automatic closing devices. They have to remain open for a minimum of 10 seconds. The electric eye faucets don't have to stay open for 10 seconds because you don't have to reach to the valve itself. That is mechanical faucets, not the electric eye faucets. That is where the 10-second rule applies. Baby changing stations, we talked a little bit about that earlier. They have to be out of the clear floor space of the water closet. Nothing can be in the clear floor space of the water closet except grab bars and toilet paper dispensers. It's our belief that paper towel dispensers and soap dispensers also cannot be in the clear floor space of the water closet. And again, if I'm looking at a baby changing table, I'm always looking at it in the up position, not in the down position. So if you can get it outside of the clear floor space of the water closet in the up position, but in the down position, it overlaps, we're fine with that. That's our opinion, however. Urinals, you're only required to have a urinal that is compliant if you have more than one. 2 or more urinals. If you only have a singular urinal, you're no longer required to have that as a compliant urinal. Urinals oftentimes are considered to be in alcoves. And the question is, where do you start measuring the 24 inches from to determine whether it's in an alcove? The proper location is 6 inches back from the front edge of the urinal, because that's where the toe space would go to under a urinal. So basically, you're going to see usually 18 inches in front of the urinal before it becomes an alcove condition, at which point then you have to go from 30 inches wide to 36 inches wide. So again, if it's less than 24 inches, it's 30 inches. If it's greater than 24 inches deep, it's 36 inches minimum in width. And it's always 17 inches max to the front edge of the urinal. And watch the flush valves, they're 48 inches max. California, 44, keep that in mind, 44. And then you always want to make sure that you have an elongated urinal, and it's 13.5 minimum from the back rear wall. Signage, coming down to the end here for signage, we're looking at signs are 48 inches to 60 inches max to the bottom of the lowest tactile character to the bottom of the highest tactile character. Braille is not a tactile character, so it's the raised characters that you put on there. The Braille can be lower than the 48 inches. It's the tactile characters. And if you read carefully, you'll see that tactile characters are sort of defined in the standard as to what they are. So that's why Braille is not a tactile character, even though you read it in a tactile manner. Then you have to have the 18 inches minimum by 18 inches minimum clear floor space that the sign has to be centered in. That's 80 inches high minimum. Keep in mind that the idea is that that door cannot swing over that 18 inches. So if the door swings away from you, that 18 inches minimum can be over in front of the door a little bit. If the door swings towards you, it cannot. That's a little bit of a space saver, just so you know. And then what kind of signs are we looking for? Raised letters. You have to have raised letters, tactile characters. You have to have Braille. You do not necessarily have to have the icons, but if you do, they have to comply with the standard. You only have to provide the ISA at toilet compartments or doors to toilet rooms, not toilet compartments, but doors to toilet rooms when not all toilet rooms are accessible. But if they're all accessible, you don't have to provide the ISA. And then, of course, you've got the door on the right there that doesn't comply in any way, shape, or form, right? Some more examples. The door on the left right there is clearly a California door. The circle and triangle are only required in California. They are not required in any other part of the country. So don't install them. But California you're going to still have to provide the door on the right-hand side right there. And it is, that's an example of where the 18 inches cannot extend in front of the door. So that sign would not be in a proper location. And then the last thing is that door on the right, a sign on the right, kind of funny, is the Braille dots fell off. So they went through and filled in all of the little areas with Sharpie marker, thinking that that was going to make it compliant. So that's the end of my bloviating for the day. And this is my email address. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to get an email from you and answer your questions. I travel all the time. I sit in airports. It's easy for me to fire back an email response. Just remember, please, that it's about worth sometimes what you paid for it. Is nothing, but I'm happy to give you my opinion and share with you whatever we know. So, again, if you want to email, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much for listening to me bloviate today. And I apologize again for our technical difficulties at the beginning.
Okay, thanks, Brad. I'm gonna try to get through some of these questions here, and let's see if we can answer some of them. Just to let everyone know, we'll kind of work this into the break and start the second session a little bit later, so we can try to answer some of your questions here.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay. In regards to a 2-story building, would an elevator be required if the first floor exceeds 3,000 square feet, but the second floor is under 3,000 square feet?
No, it would not. It's buildings that are 3 stories or less, or 3,000 square feet per floor. So I could have a 5-story building that's 3,000 square feet per floor or less and not require an elevator. Or I can have a 2-story building that's 100,000 square feet and not require an elevator.
Okay. And we had a couple questions about sanitary napkin disposal and dispensers. So let's see. Are the sanitary napkin disposal and toilet seat cover dispensers required items in a restroom or toilet compartment?
They are not required elements. If provided, they must comply, but they are not required.
Okay, and then is there a requirement for the location of the sanitary napkin disposal? We have seen them placed next to the toilet paper dispenser, but closer to the back wall. However, depending on the type, you cannot open them due to the clearance to the toilet.
Okay. Under the ADA, there is not a there is no requirement for where to place them. California requires them to be placed between the toilet paper dispenser, placed between the toilet paper dispenser and the rear wall. That, in our opinion, is the correct location for them and where they should be installed. But under the ADA, it's not a requirement. The one thing that you do have to be careful of is when you do install them, you need to make sure that they are accessible. A lot of times we see them installed too high and you can't open the lid because of the grab bar. And you have to make sure that you have 1.5 inches below the grab bar. So you have to make sure that it's below that as well.
Okay. Let's see, another one. If I'm understanding correctly, it is allowable to have a toilet compartment wall that go to the floor as long as there is an extra 6 inches of clearance within the accessible toilet compartment. Is this correct?
That is correct. You have to put the toe space inside the toilet compartment.
What's a good distance for showing the clear floor space at a lab when you never know exactly what type of sink is being specified or to allow for the trap?
Can you repeat that again, please?
So what's a good distance for showing the clear floor space at a lab when you never know exactly what type of sink is being specified or to allow for the trap?
Well, at 27 inches above the floor, you have to have 8 inches minimum in depth. At 9 inches, excuse me, it's at 9 inches above the floor, you have to have a minimum of 11 inches in depth. And you have to have a clear floor space or a toe space that extends a minimum of 17 inches under the lavatory. So that also means that at 9 inches, it has to be a minimum of 17 inches deep. So as long as you meet those requirements, that tells you what you have to have as far as the lavatory goes. It can be deeper than that, but it can't be less than that. So as long as you specify that and the contractor can build it to that, doesn't matter what lavatory is provided. We just know the most common ones, the drain pipe is usually 9 inches back. So it meets the 8-inch requirement, but does create problems when the drain pipe goes too low, that it does intrude into the angled knee clearance.
Okay, and we'll just do one last question here. Rooms to try and close in retail sales, any ADA requirements?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that first part?
Yes, are there any ADA requirements for the rooms to try on close for retail sales?
Oh, okay. Dressing and fitting rooms. Yes, there are. You have to have a turning space within the room. So 60 inches under the ADA. The door has to have the door maneuvering clearances within it. The bench has to be a minimum size and 17 to 19 inches off the floor. Plus, you have to have a 30 by 48 clear floor space on the short side of the bench so that somebody can pull their wheelchair up and transfer over onto the bench. And you have to be able to see the mirror from the bench. If you provide a mirror in the dressing room, you don't have to provide a mirror, but if you do, you have to be able to see it from the bench. And you should not put any kind of a grab bar or anything on the backside of on the wall on the backside of the bench. It does need to be fixed, or it has to have a fixed